And this morning, in meeting many of the executives here, many people from different facets, marketing, the newsroom, the business office, advertising, were asking, well, how can we find our way through this? How can we divine a way, fathom a way to figure out how to utilize this dramatic change in our life? And to the best of my knowledge, and I dare say the best of not just my own knowledge, but also people like me who consult or teach in this area, the one thing we as a group of experts have found, the one thing that seems to be a good way of looking at these changes, is actually a subject which I have to say I flunked in college, and that's economics. I retook the course, and actually things worked out well. But to a large degree, the principle of supply and demand is a good mechanism for trying to understand what's going on in terms of the world of media today. Because it's a good way of using it as a prism to see the entire spectrum of change. And this word spectrum, I think, is important because there are many facets, many different colors of this change that are going on. In fact, there's many parts of it that we haven't actually begun to see. It's almost like infrared or ultraviolet light, where we can't quite discern it, but it has a profound effect on our life, particularly if you've ever been sunburned. Principle of supply and demand is a good way of doing this because as things change from scarcity to surplus, there's the word surfeit, I believe, which means overload. It has profound changes on our lives, our businesses, how we learn things, and what goes on in our societies politically and economically. And in fact, much like light, if I go back and forth between those two slides, in optics, there are certain primary colors, red, green, and blue, or in case there are printers in the audience, cyan, magenta, and yellow. But you can divide light up into certain primary colors, and to a degree you can do that to some of these changes. And I think it's safe to say that in some ways the effects of this change that's going on in our life can be divided into certain primary categories, or I'll call them primary colors in this case. And these are, if you'll forgive me, I'm an academic and I have to give big names to things. I'm going to call them transactional effects, definitional effects, and gravitational effects. Transactional effects, obviously, are things that have to do with the value of content, the price of content. Will people pay for online content, for instance? Or how it's packaged? Or how the business model works. The definitional effects of this stuff, if you're a journalist in the audience, this is your key area because this change from scarcity to surplus is starting to have effects on how we define what information is. What's a story? Is it a complete story? Is it a right to go with something incomplete? Do people want information that's only piecemeal? Do they want it in high quality, low quality? How people consume information has changed because of this change from scarcity to surplus. When I showed the slide a little earlier talking about a change from people consuming things from analog to digital, one of the problems many of the companies I deal with, and I made this mistake myself, is that we initially thought in the 90s that if we just simply take the content we have traditionally provided as media companies and put that online, in other words in digital format, we'll be fine. But what we found is people are consuming in different ways. They're consuming things in digital, but they're consuming things in digital that are different than what they consumed in traditional media. It's changed how they consume. So this area, which I'll get into if you'll just forgive me in a few minutes, is for you if you're a journalist or an editor. And then gravitational effects, that might seem a little mysterious, but going along with my example there from the movie of 2001, this is a somewhat esoteric field, but this area, gravitational effects, which I'll explain why I use that term, are the most profound, and I think if you'll forgive me, I'm going to actually lead off with that in describing these three effects. Because what happens when people have access to that information? I don't know, the first time you ever actually went online or got broadband, it probably changed how you consume media. I remember it's like, whoa, I got access to all this, and look at that, I can find this. It actually almost gave me almost a weightless feeling to a large degree. But what has happened is that as we've moved from a world where you had access to only a few TV stations, a few newspapers, and, a few magazines, to this whole cornucopia of information, is it's only natural that people tend to gravitate towards those sources of information that matches their interests. If I were to ask people in this audience what their interests are, talk about thousands of answers. You know, each of us here in this room, we probably have a few common interests. In fact, if I were to ask you to name a few interests that are common to every single person in this room, can anybody venture a guess what those would be? And I'm hoping if you're in the newsroom, you'd be able to come up with a guess pretty quickly. I'll give you I'll start. The weather, for instance. We all want to know what the weather is. But, I'm kidding. Any other interests that are common to everybody in this room? Food. Good. I was hoping somebody would say that. This is the only country in the world I'd get that answer. Food, because there's the best food in the world. When coming here, they were making the arrangements. Is there anything we can get you? Yeah, you can tell me where the nearest food court to the hotel is. True. So that's two. And by the way, I asked this question to a group of editors, a meeting of the Associated Press in the United States, and the editors of the major newspapers of the country, of my country, could come up with only 3 common answers. Because the fact is that we have very few totally common interests. There are certain group interests. For instance, there might be a number of fans of a particular cricket team here, or fans of a particular fashion designer, or people have a common hobby or common interest. There are group interests. But each and every one of you here has specific interests that probably no one else in this room might share. You know, the 500, 600 people on here. Each person has dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of specific hobbies or interests or favorite authors or favorite readings, things of this sort. And it's that mix of the few common interests, the group interests, and these individual interests, that unique mix that makes us individuals. And what happens when we have access now to 250 million websites, hundreds of TV channels, hundreds or thousands of magazines, is we naturally tend to pick and choose and go find the things that match our interests. It's just human interest. It's the way naturally people will behave in that case. Here's a quote. Forgive me, it's a little bit long for a PowerPoint slide, but from Peter Horrocks, the director of worldwide services at a small little media company known as the British Broadcasting Corporation, the world's largest media company, who points out last year that most media companies assume that our package of information, be it the Straits Times or the New York Times, would satisfy every interest. But the fact is, people who have access to all this information are now looking at the internet, cable, magazine, everything as one giant package that they have. And they're picking and choosing from all these various sources. Even Peter Horrocks here, who goes to various sites for various types of information. So it's profoundly changed how we use information. And indeed, actually, before going to that slide, how many of you each day will use a search engine? You know, right. And average in surveys, I'm not going to go through the guessing game here a little bit, or poll you people. Most people go to anywhere from 5 to 20 different sites each day if they have online access and they have time, a few minutes to do something like that. Yet why do you do that if you had access to mainstream media? Isn't mainstream media satisfying your interests? And I hate saying that, by the way, because I'm from mainstream media. Well, the fact is you're doing it because you are gravitating to the things that match your individual interests. That's why you use the search engine. That's what's made Google and Yahoo such big companies. It's this gravitation of people going to find the sources of things that match their interests.